This is lecture 14A. I'm going to talk about the nomadic peoples of Central Asia because they really explode into world history about 1000, maybe even 900 CE, and they really are major players in Eurasian politics up until the 1300s, and then their influence kind of wanes quite a bit. So when I'm talking about the nomadic peoples of Central Asia, there are lots and lots of different groups, and the Central Asia, the northern portion of Asia and Central Asia is really, often wide open steppes, wide open grasslands. It's usually too dry for really great agriculture, but it's very good for pastoralism. You can move herds of animals around and move to good pasture and by moving on an annual cycle. And the nomadic peoples of Central Asia had a long history of living nomadically. They'd move around. They often lived in yurts, which are big circular tents, and they could pack it all up and move to new pastures. And they generally would raise animals, and they would live off the meat and the milk from the animals. But they would also trade. They would periodically just go find cities, and they would trade for things that they needed. So they would trade, leather goods made from the animal skins. They would trade, anything that they could produce from animals, and then they would, in return, they would get spices, metalwork, things that they couldn't produce because they were nomadic, and so they had a sort of a symbiotic relationship with all these trade cities along the Silk Roads and things like that. But periodically they would also raid those cities. They would put together a fairly large military force and go raid stable, settled civilizations because they knew where they were, right? Now there's all sorts of groups of nomads across Central and Northern Asia. I mean, we've already run into the Xianbei and the Jurchen in northern China. I've mentioned the Turks, and we're going to meet the Mongols soon. There's all sorts of different groups, and they generally were very loosely organized. They were pretty much organized on families, and then into larger tribes and clans. But that was a really loose organization because they were moving all the time. They were constantly splitting away from each other and reuniting. And so there were lots of different ethnic groups that would pop up in history and then disappear again. And so it's hard to, you can talk about the Turks because they speak a group of languages that are Turkic. They're all related to Turkish. You can talk about the Mongols. They have a different language group. But within those, there are all sorts of different ways you can divide up the Turks into different groups, and you'll see different names for different groups of Turks, etc. And so they don't have really strong governments. Now, there are some points later where the Turks and Mongols control governments, but even then they often had a very loose government structure. It was based on sort of kinship ties and clan, and it was not based on what we'd think of as settled government with defined roles for different people and different governors of provinces, etc. So it was loose. It was fluid. Okay. Now, the Turks and Mongols had enormous military potential because they were fantastic horsemen. They were on horseback all the time. From the time they were children, they were riding horses. And so they were really fantastic at riding horses. But they also, because of the harsh conditions they lived in with the harsh winters and the wide open steppes, they were really hardy in the sense that they could handle a whole lot of hardship. They were used to it. Okay, and now in addition, the Turks and Mongols both were very good at fighting from horseback. In particular, they were great with bows and arrows off of horseback. They were great at attacking and shooting arrows from a galloping horse, etc. And so they had enormous military potential. But they often didn't realize that potential because their organization was so fluid that it was hard for them to put together a coherent military force and to enforce military discipline for long enough periods of time to significantly conquer lots of territories. Now, we saw some examples of nomadic peoples putting together a significant army for short periods of time, like the Jurchen nomads taking over northern China, or the later Tang Dynasty calling in the Turks to take over to conquer Beijing. But these generally were these sorts of military forces didn't hold together very well. And so they often had a hard time holding on to territory after they'd conquered it, because they just simply didn't have the sort of settled institutions that sedentary civilizations had developed. So when we talk about these nomadic peoples, we're generally talking about people who have enormous military potential, but they often don't have the organization to really realize that potential and really reach their full potential. But there were times and places where these nomadic peoples played enormous roles in the military history of Eurasia. Now, I want to talk about several. First, I want to talk about the Turks. Now, the Turks, had been in Central Asia for however long. We know that about 500, the Turks generally converted to Buddhism, and then they converted to Christianity, and then they converted later to Islam. And by the time they really get onto the field, onto history as we understand them, they're already converted to Islam. So we saw already that the Turks showed up in several places. I mentioned that in India, beginning in the 1000s, Turkish raiders would come down into northern India in larger and larger groups to conquer, to raid northern India, conquer cities, loot, pillage, etc. And that eventually they destabilized those kingdoms so much that they could take over northern India, and they established the Sultanate of Delhi, which lasted from the 1200s to the 1500s. Then I also mentioned previously the Seljuk Turks, who were Turks who began to move in the 800s and 900s down into northern Persia, and they had some success at establishing small kingdoms or even fairly large kingdoms in western and northern Persia. But they ran up against the Abbasids, and what began to happen then is that they would either be minor rulers under the Abbasids, or many Turks would move into Abbasid territory and begin to be mercenaries for the Abbasids. But there were times that the Turks actually managed to take over the Abbasids. In 1055, the Seljuk Turks conquered Baghdad, and they made the Abbasid Caliph. They kept the Abbasid Caliph as a religious figure, but they named themselves sultans. And I mentioned before, when I was talking about the Sultanate of Delhi, that sultan is a purely military title. It means a sort of a military governor. And so what the Turks did is they conquered the Abbasid Caliphate. They kept the caliph as technically in charge, but they created this office of sultan, which was the real ruler of the Abbasid Caliphate. And so the Seljuk Turks basically took over the Abbasid Caliphate from inside without destroying it, right? And then I talked also previously about, when I was talking about the Byzantine Empire, how beginning in the 900s or so, Turks began to move west into Anatolia, which is modern-day Turkey, and they began to do raids on the Byzantine Empire. And one of those raids led to the Battle of Manzikert in 1071, which destroyed the Byzantine army and allowed the Turks to take over a big chunk of Anatolia, and it really crippled the Byzantine army. And it crippled the Byzantine Empire as a whole, because the lost revenues from Anatolia really damaged the Byzantine budget, but also the military losses to the Turks destroyed Byzantine ability to resist future Turkish incursions. So the Battle of Manzikert was a real blow to the Byzantine Empire. They would hold on for another 400 years, but the Byzantine Empire would keep shrinking after that and would not do well. And then, of course, I mentioned previously with the Byzantine Empire that one of the results of the victory of the Seljuk Turks at Manzikert was that the Byzantines asked for help from Western Europe, and this set off the Crusades, right? And so then the Middle East and the Turks had to face European crusaders coming in and fighting them between 1096 and the about 1300. Now the last area of that the Turks were important I want to mention is the Mamluks. Now, Mamluks were not, strictly speaking, Turks. What the Mamluks were was that under the late Byzantine or under the late Abbasids, they had a group of slaves that were made into soldiers, sort of slave mercenaries, and they were given special privileges. They actually were fairly privileged. They could have, they could get married, they could own property, etc. But they were still slaves. They had to do what the Abbasid caliph said. Well, large numbers of these Mamluks were actually Turkish. Now, some were not Turkish, so you can't say the Mamluks were just Turkish, but significant numbers of the Mamluks were Turks. And what we see is that the Mamluks actually, as a military caste, take over Egypt and would rule Egypt from the very late Abbasids, 1200s, up until the 1500s. So they're roughly the same time as the Sultanate of Delhi, that the Mamluks would rule Egypt, and they were largely Turkish. Now again, there were some Mamluks who weren't Turkish. Mamluk is a slave status. But in any case, so Turks had a major role to play at various points, and Turks often provided the soldiers, the cavalry in particular, for the Abbasids or for other governments. And so the Turks would have a major role to play in India, a major role to play in the Middle East, and down into Egypt and in Anatolia. And of course, the Turks remain in Anatolia, and today it's Turkey. So the Turks were the first nomadic peoples to come out, but soon after the Turks, we see another nomadic people come exploding out of Central Asia, and that's the Mongols. So we'll talk about that in the next part of the lecture.